Whenever we talk about human rights, we essentially focus on civil and political rights in Fiji. Reality is that now the Fijian constitution gives a whole plethora of rights that includes also socioeconomic rights. And fundamentally, that has always been absent from the equation, both in substance, in respect of whether it's included in our constitutions or not. For the first time, we have a very comprehensive Bill of Rights pertaining to socioeconomic rights, and this constitution has that. Indeed, many people would argue that many of the civil and political issues that have emanated, in particular, not just since '87, but from our colonial times, post-independence Fiji, has fundamentally been because of the fact that we have had a breach of socioeconomic rights. This manifests itself into civil and political issues. So, for example, when you have villages that don't have access to water, electricity, basic amenities that other people enjoy, you have farmers drinking from creeks, or you have people who don't have electricity, and there's a huge disparity between Fijians, then that could also lead to civil and political unrest too. In fact, many countries have argued that, have taken a very dichotomous approach to the rights discourse. If you look at some of the Asian countries, they tend to focus, countries even like Singapore, tend to focus more on socioeconomic rights as opposed to civil and political rights. Some countries have said, well, we need civil and political rights at the expense of socioeconomic rights. One extreme example would be, as I said probably about a week ago, is that USA. It's one of the most unequal societies in the world today because of the huge economic disparity between the haves and the have-nots. Whilst it's so lauded as the country with many civil and political rights. One, of course, can argue about that also. But the reality is that in order to be able to understand human rights, you need to be able to understand the range of civil and political and socioeconomic rights, because they actually feed into each other, and it is very, very important. In Fiji's case, of course, the recent study shows that inequality in Fiji actually has dropped. It's one of the 5 countries, only 5 countries in the entire Asia-Pacific region where inequality has dropped. So that obviously is a very positive space to be in, but of course there's a lot more work that needs to be done. The question I want to ask, of course, is for you, those of you who are journalists, I see there's quite a few people from the civil society organizations too, is how well do you understand the human rights discourse? Is it simply because you think that somebody gets bashed up by the police officer or because there's some military involvement, therefore that's the only time you report on human rights? Do you actually understand socioeconomic rights? How well do you understand the various provisos to even civil and political rights? As has been mentioned, for example, freedom of speech, of course, is enjoyed in a country like Australia. I see that some people here from ABC, they have a huge restriction on the right to speech. You have racial vilification laws in place. Now, but in Fiji, of course, it would appear, and I hate to say that the level of maturity, as I've said previously before, in terms of also the political landscape, but also in respect of the human rights landscape, there's not enough maturity displayed by journalists, displayed by people who are actually commentators on human rights, about the depth of human rights and how actually human rights does work. In Fiji, of course, the other elephant in the room is the whole issue of indigenous rights. Many people have used indigenous rights as a means, as a sledgehammer to squash the rights of other people. They have not contextualized indigenous rights. They have not understood what's the genesis, what's the epistemological basis of indigenous rights. Where did it come from? How did it start? Which countries did it pertain to? So all of these things are actually not understood. So you have journalists reporting simply because somebody says something out of their mouth, they simply report it without understanding what the actual issue is in itself, without actually understanding the legal framework, without actually understanding the history of it. And I think that's where there's a lack of maturity, frankly, to be frank with you, as far as journalists reporting on human rights in Fiji is concerned. And I think also, frankly, some of the multilateral agencies have also fallen for that. They have failed to actually provide that opportunity, that environment for people to actually understand in detail, to have some credible analysis of human rights and or its breaches in Fiji. And I hope this workshop is going to do that. you provide them that framework, that opportunity to do that. I see the second session is about, understanding Fiji. The session is about, about understanding Fiji. But you need to also understand human rights concepts too. You need to know the difference between a convention and a declaration. I mean, all these sorts of things people don't actually understand. And I see some media organizations simply become the mouthpieces of people who utter words pertaining to human rights. Suddenly, as soon as somebody says human rights breach, everybody sort of jumps on the bandwagon without actually critically analyzing what the situation is. So I think in order to be able to report on human rights, you need to be able to understand exactly what the subject matter is, and to be able to develop the level of maturity, the level of understanding as to how these concepts have actually developed, when it is applicable. The other point I want to make also, lastly, finishing off, as I mentioned at the workshop, Kavita was there, in respect of where they had the moot competition for the lawyers, and they're going to have, I think they're going to moot on human rights, is that in Fiji we have seen that people tend to, hang on or sort of grab on to human rights depending on who the perpetrator is or the victim is. So this is why some people, quite actually, in an acceptable manner, will justify 1987 and the subsequent human rights abuses following 87 and 2000 and justify it and make it acceptable. But in the same breath, they will say what happened in 5 December 2006 subsequently is not acceptable. That is not actually a very principled position. And that, we believe, actually demonstrates the lack of understanding what human rights actually is. So again, you see, it clearly demonstrates that if the victim is somebody else, and many would argue the victims in 87 and 2000 were a particular group of people, then it is okay. But if the supposed victims post 5 December 2006, whether it's perception, is somebody else, then it's not okay. You have people in parliament saying that, you have journalists saying that. The famous Chandrika Prasad case after the events of 2000, which actually challenged the creation of a interim government following the events of 2000, when the High Court actually ruled that the government that actually had been removed illegally needed to be actually put back into the helm, into the seat of government, and it was not followed, the Fiji Times editorial, one of the editorials said, "Peace now, justice later." Peace now, justice later. Now, that demonstrates that even media organizations can actually be the great purveyor of not the truth, because they fall for that political discourse at that point in time, which is actually political expediency at that point in time. So you see, we need to be able, if you are seriously honest, if you want to be able to report truly about human rights, and if you are actually advocates or disciples of human rights, you need to be honest with yourself. And that honesty actually requires a very critical analysis of the past. It requires a critical analysis of where we came from. I don't just mean 87. I mean about the fact that we are a post-colonial state. People today, till today in Fiji, actually believe something is a breach of a human right depending on what ethnic group the victim belongs to. It's a fact. We have to accept that. You cannot hide that. You need to come to terms with that. You have to come to terms with that. And that is a reality. Only then truly you can report on human rights. Only then truly you can be objective about the principles, the wonderful conventions that Chitra is talking about. There's no point going there and signing conventions. I mean, frankly, our provision in the Constitution pertaining to socio-economic and civil political rights, in fact, our provisions are a lot more onerous, and a lot more onerous than some of the conventions. The other final point I want to make also is this. Again, what Chitra mentioned, it's only vis-a-vis the state. You have to understand in Fiji now that the Constitution now allows the application of human rights both vertically and horizontally. In other words, it's not just between the state and the citizen, but it's also within within individual actors themselves. So you could actually have, for example, under the 1997 Constitution, for example, certain clubs were exempt because they were discriminated against women. There's one particular club I know in Fiji, women cannot go to a particular section of the bar because they're only reserved for men. The 1997 Constitution actually allowed for that to happen because the application of that right was only allowed vertically, not horizontally. So how many of you actually know that? How many of you know that the rights in Fiji are horizontally applicable too? Those rights are equally applicable against individual players in the state, individual players within the country, against companies, against clubs, against societies that may exist. That's also very important to understand, because sometimes you'll find some of the greatest perpetrators of these are actually not necessarily state actors themselves, but those outside the state realm. So again, I would urge you to use this opportunity to be actually frank and honest about human rights itself. It requires a critical analysis of where we are as a country, where we have come from, and indeed where we want to go. So sometimes I find that what's actually happened in Fiji, because somebody says something, everybody simply jumps on the bandwagon. They kind of pick up the mantra of it and go along with it, as opposed to being critically honest about it, as opposed to thinking exactly where we're coming from, where we are going, what has actually happened in the past. And only then I think you can truly report in a very objective manner regarding human rights. Thank you very much, and I wish you a good day. Vinaka.